So welcome back to part 2 of our e-commerce panel discussion. We have a few really expert folks who are in the front of the industry. I'll hand it off to Israel to introduce our panelists.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Before we started recording, I was just talking how we had the pleasure to have pretty much the same group of people for our JS World Conference back in February. We had a really nice discussion about the future of e-commerce and headless, but we eventually went into the performance territory, and we figured out it was really, really interesting to explore that in a second part of the panel. So this is what we're going today, and as for the panel, I'm just going to go in the order I see you in the screen. So I'm going to start with Annie Sullivan. She's part of the metrics team at Google. Hello, Annie. We also have Guillermo Rauch, CEO at Vercel. We have Ishan, Anand, CTO at Layer Zero. We have Filip Rakowski, co-founder at VueStoreFront, and we have Tim Benniks, principal developer advocate at Uniform. So thank you all for being here. Well, we left our panel last time going into the performance conversation, and I really distinctly remember talking about how the date of May was going to be very important because, as we know, Core Web Vitals have been included now into what the search rankings, into the page ranking algorithm. So I wanted to maybe start with you, Annie. You are part of the metrics team, and we have been hearing about how Core Web Vitals has evolved internally at Google. We are recording this a week before Google I/O, so I'm sure that by the time you're seeing this panel, we have heard more updates on how Core Web Vitals have evolved. And but what can you tell us about this whole process? How has it been for your team? And I would like to then explore what does this mean specifically for commerce, but yeah, let's start with that part. How has the metrics collection and design evolved for you?
So basically at the beginning, we had a couple of really key goals that we wanted to achieve. The first thing was we wanted to have metrics that focus on user experience and how positive the user experience is. And we really wanted a couple of specific metrics. We wanted a metric that really measures when the content is available when a page is loaded. A lot of other page load metrics are more like right when the user can see anything, or more focused on like technical parts of the page load. So we wanted something that was really user focused. We wanted to balance that with something, so that's largest contentful paint, and we wanted to balance that with the first input delay metric, which makes sure that the page is a bit interactive as well as it's loading. So it paints fast and interacts quickly. And then we really wanted something that's even more focused on the user experience outside of performance. And one thing that we're really frustrated by is when just things shift around when you're trying to read them. It's a very frustrating experience on the web. So we added the cumulative layout shift metric in order to focus on that. And so it's been a long journey in doing like a ton of analysis and understanding and listening to developers and trying to stabilize at the same time evolve the metrics to kind of focus on user experience and at the same time make it achievable for developers.
One question that surfaced on our panel last time was how are these metrics taking consideration of modern frameworks that do a lot of client-side routing, for example? Is that going to be something that has a detrimental effect on how cumulative layout shift is measured, for example?
So it shouldn't have a detrimental effect on the metrics. For cumulative layout shift, we've just published an update to the metric that basically caps the amount of layout shift, so that it's not just single page apps, but pages that were open for a very long time kind of had some issues with cumulative layout shift. So we published an update that effectively limits the layout shift to the worst window. For single page apps over time, we're really looking at ways to handle the routing better. But our initial focus was that initial page load. So it's something we're working on evolving over time.
It's there's an update on that. That's really cool. And one of such frameworks, and I remember from the conversation, was of course Next.js. And what's your opinion on this side, Guillermo? You also recently launched a whole e-commerce suite of tools for developers and the e-commerce side of Next.js. So is this set of metrics something that you took in consideration when designing this new platform?
Yeah, I would even say that when we created Next, we're thinking about these metrics, only that they weren't well defined as they are today. So I considered Core Web Vitals to be one of the greatest technical accomplishments for the web community, because it's hard with modern web systems to define metrics, period. So when we were doing like old Web 1.0 stuff, we're getting a response from a server. It ran to completion. We're getting a payload of HTML, right? And like things were kind of easy. Like teams would look at like P99 of server response times. Now we have this like monster that loads on the client side. So to Annie's point, like you have to think about SPAs and layouts and CSS and order of resources loading. So the fact that these metrics are so user-centric, I love. When we started Next, we're also frustrated about the idea that, oh, like you load the page and all you see is a spinner. I actually mentioned that in one of the essays that inspired Next that I wrote in 2014. And now with largest contentful paint, well, a spinner will never be a large content. So it accommodates for that. So these metrics are almost like encapsulating a lot of the design principles and even pet peeves personally, because I've also always hated layouts shifting. So the fact that now there's a metric to encapsulate something as jarring to the end user, I love it. And obviously we're working on, making them great out of the box with Next.js to the extent that we can. With Vercel Analytics, we're trying to like monitor them over time. A huge can of worms, especially in e-commerce, is always third-party scripts. So it's not enough that you get good web vitals when you're developing. It's not enough that you do it in the lab. You also have to monitor them over time. You have to be mindful of scripts that evolve over time. So it's a complex problem, but now we have good rails, I think.
And particularly in the case of headless e-commerce, as we're talking on our panel, because when you have the full monolith, let's say, trying to be designed around how it internally works and how it presents that information, okay. But when then you decouple the front end and you try to present an omnichannel experience, things can get trickier if these are not well designed as well. And I wanted to take your opinion as well, Filip, on this side. So VueStoreFront being one of the leading headless e-commerce front ends out there, the storefront experience. You mentioned in our previous panel as well how important the metrics have been for you on identifying which optimizations to apply. But how do you prepare for, as Guillermo mentioned, the addition of, additional trackers, additional plugins, additional things that developers may add on the front end? So is this something your modular system takes in consideration?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that's actually a very broad topic to discuss, because essentially like what we would like to defend ourselves from is an impact of third-party code on our website. And obviously it's not so easy. And with VueStoreFront 1, so the previous version or the current version until last month, it was a real problem because we took a lot of time to optimize the default theme. We took a lot of time, to show how great it is. We optimized every tiny bit of it, but it was worthless after an hour of the development, because then people started adding, unoptimized images, moment.js without any optimization, Lodash, some trackers, and then you're starting from like a very well optimized website. And after 2 days, it could be really, really badly optimized. So for VueStoreFront 1, that was the actual issue. And for VueStoreFront 2, we thought, okay, so there's not that much we can do about this. I mean, we can evangelize, we can put best practices in our documentation, we can do some boilerplates for libraries. So the library authors are following best practices because it's just more convenient for them, because the boilerplate is following these best practices. But apart from this, there's not that much except architectural choices and kind of like forcing your users to do things in a certain way. there's not that much that you can do to actually optimize the performance. So what we did actually is we introduced the concept of a middleware to every VueStoreFront website. And in this middleware, we are doing a little bit more than orchestrating data. So the whole goal of VueStoreFront middleware, which is basically a tiny process that lives within Next, it's not like a fully featured API gateway. So the main point of this is to have a business logic running on the server side. So you have consistent experience across different devices, because it takes totally different time to parse, let's say, some amount of JavaScript on low-end device, on high-end device, on desktop. So the experience could be really inconsistent for your users. And usually, the network is rarely a bottleneck these days, but the computing power still is. And I think the mistake that people are making when creating a single-page applications and client-side applications is that they are putting all the code on the client side. And it could sound, unintuitive, but building client-side application doesn't mean you should put all the code on the client side. And I think that's one of the key misconceptions, and also one of the reasons why the progressive web apps are not bringing this, the promised performance, because they're just not implemented well. So I think it's on us, on the whole industry, to promote best practices and also to kind of enforce good practices through architecture. And this is what we are doing.
In a sense, I get then the idea of the head you need to add to a headless system is not just the client side. It's not just the JavaScript that is sent to the browser. It may be this combination of work done on the server to prepare. And I think both Layer 0 and Uniform are in this intersection, right? Layer 0 more going towards the personalization side and what you get out of the individual experience. Uniform being also in let's say the other side, the preparation, the combination between all of these different services that are gathering data. I'm going to go, let's say, to that front side first with you, Ishan. So personalization, optimization, and what we're discussing about having a less bloated client.
Yeah, really important.
What's in your mind here?
Yeah, so, we like to say that we're the neck for headless. You do need something, it's sometimes referred to as a backend for the front end, something that orchestrates your APIs, something that does your server-side rendering, or your static builds, if that's the way you're going. And that's really important. That's built into Layer 0 platform, as many others. There's a couple things we've baked into the platform to address Core Vital specifically. There's a lot of things to optimize the network and make that really fast. And then there's a lot of things in there to measure your Core Vitals. So if you're going to actually go through and optimize your Core Vitals, actually, let me back up a second. So last panel, I was probably the most strident panelist around Core Vitals. And I want to thank Annie and the Google team, because for it feels like years now, it's only been a year that Core Vitals was announced, but we've been blogging and trying to scream at the top of our lungs about the issues with CLS. And between the last part 1 of this panel and part 2, they proposed an alternative and they're fixing it. So that's great. So that's really good. And I'm really happy. That's actually the #1 thing that I was most probably strident about last time. And the new proposal is great. There's still some challenges, I think, with modern frameworks, though, that folks are going to have that, Filip was referring to, that you put too much code on the client. Byte for byte, Adi Aswani talks about the cost of JavaScript. It's the most, costly asset you can send down sometimes. And there is this challenge when you're doing a heavy client-side app with, modern frameworks that you can run into problems. I would say the next thing I would love Google to start tackling is largest contentful paint. The problem you will have is, these single-page apps have the best experience possible. They're the closest thing to native apps. In fact, if you look at Core Web Vitals, my philosophy is Google is doing this to make the web better, because right now on your device, that web page is competing with not just another e-commerce site, but Netflix and TikTok and all the other native apps. So you really need to match that user expectation. And the best way to do this is actually these modern frameworks. Those single page app transitions can be 300, 400 milliseconds, even better. But Core Vital still won't track those for LCP. And that would be the next thing I'd want them to tackle. The other challenge, I think, if you're practically looking at this and you're in e-commerce and you're tackling Core Vitals, Generally, CLS has been a problem. With the new metric, I think it's going to get better. FID, I will tell you, for most e-commerce folks at the high end, we've not seen as much an issue. LCP would be the other place that you can run to from. The biggest challenge, though, is Google gives you like 4 different ways to look at your core web vitals. They give you Google Search Console, they give you data and page speed insights, and you can get it from the Crux report. And each of them give you a slightly different perspective. And when you're going through and actually taking a large enterprise e-commerce site with a lot of pages, none of them give you the instrumentation you need to say this page has really this score depending on traffic. Like Search Console will be number of pages, but not weighted by traffic, for example. And it will only show you 20 URLs in a bucket and not all of them. So what I'm coming to is if you're actually going to begin this journey to optimize your core vitals, you really need to have RUM. And you need to have RUM that doesn't have, Search Console is like a days to weeks latency if you use page speed insights. It's a 28-day rolling average. You make a change, you've got to wait, a long time to see if it's actually optimized things. So one of the things we rolled out was RUM. And that RUM really tied to real-time core web vitals. It's just focused on core web vitals analytics. It will tell you in minutes to days, how quickly those optimizations work. And I think that's really important when you're working at, trying to optimize your site as best as possible with a really large site that has a lot of pages.
That's, I think that, Annie, you were just really agreeing there with how important this is to really not only understand what you're seeing in the results, but also proactively act on it. Let's say, can you give us maybe some insights? Is this something also that the metrics team is thinking, how to make them a bit more real time, so to say?
So this is something we've worked really hard on, is to make sure that there are APIs available for every metric, that there's the largest contentful paint API, and then underneath that there's the element timing API, so that you can, measure more than just largest contentful paint. Same with the event timing API, it's first input delay, and like all of the events, and then the layout instability API underneath cumulative layout shift gives you information about every single layout shift. But our goal is that like we don't want to really compete with RUM providers. There's so many great tools out there, and the integration that Ishan was talking about, we really want to make that possible and make it possible for the whole ecosystem to offer better, faster tooling. The reason that we have the 28-day rolling window is that we want to make it possible to get as much data as possible for smaller sites, but then that's hard for larger sites, right? That really want that fast response.
Yeah, it can really vary, of course, but also the amount of data that you as a metrics team have to deal with and try to standardize, let's say, or get a common set of things must be like completely in a different level.
I totally understand the challenges they're dealing with and what it would take to make it a lot faster and why they've got a 28-day rolling average. It just practically, if you are especially a large site and you're trying to optimize it and you get this score, you're like, well, which page is it? Like you go into Search Console and it will say 10,000 pages have a poor CLS and it will only say these 20. And sometimes it groups them by like all the product pages together and you're great, it's my product pages. But I've seen firsthand where it's product page, account details page, it's a bunch of other pages. And I do think also education for the market, like folks don't realize this is independent. And to be fair to Google, they've tried to let people know this, but this is independent of crawling your site. So if you mark your page as no index, Core Vitals still will end up tracking because it's based on the real data of the browser. So I think it's actually, and Annie mentioned, they've given us information, metrics, for example, on which element shifts the page, but Google Search Console won't tell you that. You need a RUM tool that's actually going to look at every single element that gets reported by those metrics and tell you which ones are the biggest offenders. That's actually something we're going to be rolling out soon in our RUM tool. So they've done a lot to give us, I think, the hammers and nails. But I think there's still some assembly required, unless you decide to go with a platform like ours or something like that, that bundles it all together. I'd love it if they said, here's the authoritative thing. Because trying to even correlate your RUM to the values from Core Web Vitals that are publicly disclosed takes some optimization effort as well. Because, for example, only certain browsers are counted and things like that.
And for any members of the audience trying to get a hold of what we're talking about, this is real user metrics, real user metrics analytics, right? RUM. I wanted to jump real quick because when we're talking about the user part, and when we're talking about the experience that each of the users receive, on the e-commerce side, definitely personalization can be a very important factor in the purchase decision, right? Or going for one platform to the other. Team Uniform is actually working right now on this space, right, of personalization for end user. What is your opinion on what we're discussing? Is something like real user metrics part of what you also take in consideration when optimizing that personalized experience?
Well, let's think, because obviously we always take performance into account, whatever we do and whoever does it, right? But I actually think about hearing all of you speak on this stuff, it kind of, if we all take care of performance and how we compose our architectures and all of that stuff, suddenly it puts the user again in front and center, right? So we can start doing this personalization now because we actually care about RAM and about performance and all of that stuff. Because think about this. I think maybe even for 10 years, everybody is about, let's do personalization in e-commerce because you get more conversion. But we've been talking about this for 10 years, but have you actually really seen it happen? I think maybe a handful of times, right? But that's because it was so hard, because those monolithic systems weren't up to par. It was just, everything is origin based. So you constantly have to ask back to the origin, can I personalize something for a user? And it just takes a bunch of time. And now that we have all these experts pushing performance and going with composed architectures, suddenly we get all these tools in hands with like some innovative people that are like, hey, maybe personalization can now be API first. It can be decoupled. We might be able to do it on the CDN edge, maybe with edge workers or on hydration time. And then suddenly all these complicated things start to fall away. And suddenly we can actually go back to the user now after talking about all this really complicated performance stuff and actually give them a real love story between their content, right? Because I just started to work at Uniform, and what I've learned since I've been there is, as it turns out, if you personalize well to the right context of the user, you have like a 19% more conversion. That is a ridiculous number. Imagine you're selling 1 million products and you have 19% more conversion when that actually triggers properly, right? And you can also exceed expectations of people on your website and have like this pleasant surprise, and they might want to come back. And e-commerce is more than just buying shoes. It can also be booking travel and, you know, hotel stuff. And there's all this extra stuff, maybe even at a bank. And you suddenly enjoy that more because they don't give you constantly that same credit card thing that you don't want, right? So it's actually really interesting, me speaking kind of in the end now of this line of questioning, where we take this all together and look back at the user and what all of this has made possible. Right. So thanks, Annie and your team, for pushing this so hard, but also everyone else in this chat that I've spoken to, most of you, a lot about how does that personalization work, and things are changing for us. This is great. I'm happy to be here to speak to all of you.
I think Tim's actually really opened a really important point, which is the role of what we used to call the CDN and we now call the edge is going to increase, especially in, Jamstack is really just a reinterpretation of the edge. And then when you want to add new functionality like personalization on top of it, that role of that edge is just going to keep increasing as we focus on more personalized and performant experiences.
Yeah, because where I work now, we can actually also personalize on the edge for you with edge workers, right? And so if you do complain a little bit about all this JavaScript that you push into your single page app, if you actually do it properly, you can also do half of that personalization on the edge, and it's just rendered at the page level for a user in the HTML. And so hydration is much simpler. There's much less possibility for maybe layout shift, because imagine you do personalization on hydration time and there's a bit of a delay, then it's very annoying for that layout shift to happen, right? So if you can already do that on the edge, it's great. And if you think along those lines, you can also start doing A/B testing on the edge. And there's so many things you can put on top of that. All the things we use third-party scripts for now, that loader bundle that are render blocking to do an A/B test. You don't need them anymore. And suddenly all those third parties Ishan was talking about, we can just slowly get rid of them. And
that's my hope.
It's me too. And the thing is, the business is just changing, and platforms like Vercel and Layer 0 with all these extra tools that they really make all this possible. So the future is kind of bright for this stuff.
Well, we couldn't agree with you more. And I think one such aspect that maybe we can explore, if I may have, let's say, an exercise of thought here with this wonderful group is, what could we do to measure performance in an application, including in-app navigation? Because you touch an important point, Tim. The hydration step that we nowadays have can be also, let's say, a red herring in the measure of performance the client side, because server side rendered versus in-app, versus in browser rendering could really lead to very different results, and maybe not the ones that you're initially expecting. So this could also affect in terms like the feed metric, because if you touch before hydration happened, for example, you could get wildly different results. So what could we see happening, and how can we measure from the user perspective, let's say now going beyond the platform perspective, and as consumers of the different tools that we have in this wonderful panel, what can we do to let's say develop our applications better? Because you are putting the tools out there, and let's start maybe if you can give us some pointers, if I can go back to you, Guillermo. So what can we do, let's say, to make the most out of how Next.js and Vercel work together on this side, on the performance? Is there a couple of measurement tips or like, I don't know, of the rule of thumbs, let's say, that we could follow?
Yeah, I would say the first is getting the data in front of you, right? So what we recommend to our customers is, you want to do your lab testing with a Lighthouse step at development time as early as you can, continuously in CI. But then when you push and you want to get data from how the application is actually performing in the real world, you turn on Vercel Analytics, and we constantly feed you data in real time. Especially as of a few months ago, we can tell you within seconds how your pages are responding and performing by using the APIs that Annie talked about. So the same APIs that power the metrics in the Crux report, we inject a very, very lightweight payload into your Next.js page that reports those real user metrics back to us. And we also present them to you as a score. So we basically came up with a documented equation that tries to give you something that's as close as possible as a Lighthouse score, but computed from the perspective of your end users. I think my biggest tip, and this is something that Next.js has always made it a priority, is that you don't look at performance only as an optimization. Oh, like I'm gonna go check the scores and then optimize. I agree with Filip insofar. Performance really is about architecture and being performant every step of the way. Real user monitoring could allow you to capture an outlier or prevent a regression. In fact, one thing we do is we give you a little indicator of your deploy, such that you understand what your software changes are doing. And say, oh, at this deploy time, my scores got better or worse. So this has helped our customers a lot, because sometimes they upgrade Next.js, and then we hear from them, oh, Next.js 10.2 helped with my performance metrics. So obviously we love to hear that, but it's nice to have that be a part of the built-in system. So to me, the point about architecture is really important. With React Server components coming into Next.js very soon, we're going to see this systemic architectural solution to a lot of the problems that, for example, Tim was talking about. So if I'm streaming a personalization to you, I want to make it interactive as soon as possible. So with event buffering and with very granular code bundles, you can make sure that personalized rendered solution is now interactive as soon as possible. So we continue to sort of endeavor to give you architectures that have performance baked in as a top priority and not just look at it as an optimization problem.
I'd like to jump in here, not to be the wet blanket. I think the future is bright for performance because Google is imposing Core Web Vitals, and it's going to be better for users. But I think the challenge is still going to remain for developers. First of all, Core Web Vitals they reserve the right, Annie, correct me if I'm wrong, every year to change the metrics. And I'll be the first to tell you, I don't think any of them are perfect. I think there'll be no surprise there. Every single one of them, and even the revised CLS. I was on the web performance group call, still telling them, giving them my 2 cents here. But I think the ecosystem for developers is having a conversation right now about the role of JavaScript. And for example, should you build a website with, say React, where it's server-side rendered and you have hydration, and a virtual DOM, or should you have something more like Svelte? And Guillermo referred to, React server components that may also, help solve the same problem. But I think there's a evolution and, shall we say, soul searching, to use a more high-level term, about the role of JavaScript inside an app. If you want the best possible Core Web Vitals, write your page like it was 1999. Now, you won't get the same user experience, and that's where the balance of like these trade-offs of user experience versus performance get really hard and subtle. And especially if you want something that competes with native apps. Ironically, it's the first load of that single page app that's going to get penalized, but the rest of that experience is going to be better. And so if Core Web Vitals, hopefully I'm optimistic, evolves to start capturing what single page apps can do better, then I think everyone's going to be aligned and it'll work better. But I think for developers, it's still going to be, especially on the largest sites, a challenge. And especially if you're dealing with somebody who's already got a larger enterprise e-commerce site. Like, we get a lot of folks who are already large sites. They're not net new sites. If you're building a site from scratch, put Lighthouse CI on it, start fast, stay fast. That always is the easiest way. But we get plenty of people who are like, we're already slow. And if you look at the statistics Google publishes, 25% of the web passes Core Web Vitals right now. Only 25. And in e-commerce, it's only 13%. So most of the web, and they're the folks, by the way, these are the e-commerce sites that are, powering those ads that follow you around the web, right? So a huge part of the internet economy is these websites. And for those folks, I'd actually recommend ignore the Lighthouse performance score at the top. That was like the worst thing that was ever done for the web, was combine all those metrics down to one single number. It made it so everyone had a universal language they could talk about. But like TTI doesn't always correlate to fit in our experience and things like that. So my first recommendation, if you've got an existing site and you're trying to optimize your core, you're in that 90% of folks who are not passing, is first go look at your Core Web Vitals report in Google Search Console. And even if your TTI is high, but your fit is fine, which is true for a lot of e-commerce, and we can get into why that is, then ignore total blocking time, ignore TTI, and which means ignore that top Lighthouse score. So tell your CEO, because I've seen this happen. The CEO's like, hey, my Lighthouse performance score is bad. In fact, there was a report somebody did of comparing all the COVID state websites, and they ranked them on Lighthouse score. And when you looked at Core Web Vitals, they actually were all about the same. So it can be very, very misleading if you don't start with what your existing scores are and then use Lighthouse to correlate and see if you're actually improving.
Thank you, Ishan. Sorry to break in, but I've worked at agency for a long, long time, working on those huge enterprise e-commerces. And my whole job as technical director was talking about the Lighthouse score and why it didn't really fit of how fast that website was, and trying to explain to the CEO how that fits. And I'm not sure if I succeeded. In the end, we just made videos of the new version and the old version to show that the new one that we built was faster. The numbers were the same. Anyway, sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just to illustrate how
you
bad,
just got me in the feels, man.
Give me my numbers.
Like, just for Annie's reference, like you probably are aware, but we have been aware of contracts people have with various agencies where the Lighthouse score is part of the contractual requirement, and it's totally taking people potentially in the wrong direction. Now, if you have a great Lighthouse score, you probably do have a better Core Web Vitals score, but your ROI there, maybe you could have spent half the cost development time and still pass Core Web Vitals. So I think it's really important for folks to know.
To have Filip, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think this is why the recommendation has been consistent, that you combine Lighthouse's scores that you can get at development time or in CI with the actual real user monitoring. I think you always need both. If you ignore Lighthouse, then you ship 3 months later and the agency is like, oh, the real user monitoring now is showing that the performance is not good. So I think it's not a question of one or the other. And the other thing is that Lighthouse has to be.
My take was really on net new. I totally agree with you. Start fast, stay fast. If you can do Lighthouse CI, but if you're somebody who didn't start already, you've already got a site you inherited that's 5 or 10 years old. Yeah. But totally, I would use both and correlate.
Yeah, the idea behind Lighthouse, sorry to interject, the idea is to have a tool that helps you improve your performance, right? But the RUM is the actual, like what do users see? That's what you need to be focused on. And Lighthouse is to try to help you do that. But where, like you said, maybe your fit is fine. Then you don't have to worry about those parts of Lighthouse that say, how would you improve your fit? So I really agree that we should try to make that clear to people. A part where Lighthouse is really great is continuous integration, right? Like, you've got this score, you've got these things that you've optimized. Let's check it on every build and make sure you didn't regress that.
Maybe a good way to put it is like Lighthouse is the scrimmage, right? You can run that 1,000 times in your team, and then the actual football match is the RUM, is the core of vitals. The real specific concrete thing I would say is remove the score. Because you could optimize the score even when you don't need to based on your core vitals. Especially because I'm thinking not just about developers, but developers in the context which they operate, where they're non-technical stakeholders. Look at that score. I mean, the great innovation of Lighthouse when it came out was you gave everyone a single number. Now your CEO, your marketing, your QA, even your competitors could say, hey, here's how we compare on performance. But in the era of core vitals, that score doesn't necessarily correlate and can lead folks astray. And it may seem like a minor point, but as Tim and I are talking, if you're in the trenches with sites on this problem, they do tend to fixate, for lack of a better word, and it's because it's up there in the UI at the top of Lighthouse. Maybe just move it to the bottom would be kind of my concrete request.
Maybe there's an improvement in the report there to be made there. Filip, you wanted for the long time to interject. I think you have definitely something to contribute here, because this must be one of the requirements of VueStoreFront, right? Like, hey, why is not my number higher every time that I upgrade my new VueStoreFront? So what has been your experience there here as the creator of a library that many sites rely upon to get to these scores?
Yeah, so I think Ishan described this perfectly. So essentially, I love Core Web Vitals concept. I also love the fact that you managed somehow to boil down the whole performance into a single number, because it was hard to measure performance beforehand. And because of that, not many people were doing this. So making things simpler means that more people will do this because it doesn't require expertise. But also because it doesn't require expertise, people that have no idea about this field, they will treat this as a reliable source of knowledge. And because of that, we have so many clients that are telling us, for example, that the Lighthouse score has dropped after some time of using VueStoreFront. And what happened really is that you changed from Lighthouse 5 to Lighthouse 6. So the algorithm has changed. The rate has changed. So it obviously dropped for everyone. But they are seeing that the number has dropped. And they don't know really what is behind this number. They don't know even what's the difference between field data and lab data. So boiling this down to a single number is great because you're making it more accessible. But also by making it more accessible, I think there should be a little bit more of education on how to interpret this score, because really I think it's a plug, and not only for us, but also for Layer 0, also for Uniform, the business people that think that they know how to interpret Lighthouse scores.
That's a great point you mentioned. This boiling performance in general, evaluating performance of something, it's always a tricky. This is why we're having two panels about this. But then boiling it is something that can be a common language, as you all have mentioned. I think is definitely something that we can thank the Lighthouse team to do. But maybe, as Ishan mentioned, putting it a bit below, is this something that not necessarily moving the position of numbers, but are you related to the Lighthouse team, or do you know maybe if the Lighthouse course will eventually try to be closer to what the Core Web Vitals report?
Yeah, I think I'm not on the Lighthouse team, so the tooling teams are separate. And I think that you can see our org chart showing a little bit in what Ishan's saying about the difference between the tools. This is like definitely a hot topic of discussion with everybody that works on all of these tools. How can we point people more towards ROM? How can we help them understand the difference between field and ROM? These are definitely things we're thinking about a lot, and the feedback's very helpful.
That's a great to know. The feedback makes it to the right set of ears. I wanted to maybe explore. So last time we also explored a bit like where the headless e-commerce ecosystem was pointing towards. I think there's still some conversation to be had on that side, taking in consideration how the new user base that is being now put at the center by all of this performance monitoring and optimization, how these users are using a different set of devices than what the website from 1999 that we just talked about was using. So we're now in a convergence of eventual VR, AR, maybe some voice e-commerce, right? So performance will always have to do with the experience that users receive. What do you see? How do you see this evolving in the space? And well, Ishan, you have been really vocal about how for the web itself, how this has evolved and the importance of it. What do you see happening? And maybe is this something that Layer 0 is considering? Like, what is the next step for e-commerce platforms, or in general for this relationship users have with the web?
Yeah, so I think it's about the relationships users have with the web and developers have with their tooling. And for users, it's just going to be personalized, fast experiences that can compete with native apps. We actually have already seen the touchstone we need to compete against. And unfortunately, if you want to listen to, for example, one of Annie's colleagues, Alex Russell at Google, it's already having trouble competing against those native apps. So that's going to be really important. And I think Core Vitals is the number one thing it's going to do is it's going to get people to care across the organization. And so it'll be easier to win budget for performance. I think for developers, in order to achieve that performance, we're seeing the emergence of, shall we say, headless or Jamstack-like architectures. And my view on this is the heart of making those work is a reinterpretation of the role of the CDN and the edge, whether that's for personalization, whether that's for caching and CDN server-side rendering. But we're seeing, folks reimagine what the complexity around caching, which is classically one of the 2 or 3 hardest problems, depending on how you count in computer science, is. And I think that's where the future is going to lie, making that a lot easier for various sites. And I think the solutions there are going to vary across the spectrum. So for smaller sites, things like pure static are probably a great solution. You're basically, I like to call it a Jedi mind trick that forces you to write your page so it can be served from the edge. When you go to more dynamic, personalized sites, you're going to need to do things like edge workers and personalization and A/B testing, kind of the same areas that some of us up here are all working on. And I think that's where the future is going to lie, to make it easier for developers to deliver that speed in a way that's easy to reason and maintain.
I think, Ishan, on top of that is next to just the tech thing that you mentioned, I think also the experience for end users is going to probably change quite a bit. Like, I guess in 2020, we all still had this vision of this omni-channel stuff and everything is connected, but it didn't really happen. But now with COVID, everything was accelerated, right? Like things like click on collect became the norm. Suddenly I'm scanning a QR code with something and it's all connected. And I didn't do that before, even though we wanted to. And so we're going to see a blend of all these technologies. So end users are going to notice less and less of the technology being slow or not working, right? This omni-channel thing might be more normal now because of these terrible things that happened with Corona, but it's all good for our business almost, right? It's crazy. But having that performance allows you to really do more touch points and using that CDN edge for also maybe application content networks, right? Not just CDNs. And so Yeah, I'm seeing a pretty interesting thing going forward, where personalization, for example, I'm coming back to this because that's what I work on, right? It's going to also work in, like, you go to a Nike store, you pick up a shoe, it has an RFID tag, you put it on something fun, and the whole store changes into the colors that you like, and that is all connected to APIs, maybe it's Vercel or things like that. These things are going to be so much more connected. And so it's going to be a fun world for all of us working in this, I guess.
I think the lesson though for me in that is, e-commerce got pulled, they say 5 years or so forward. The requirements and demands for performance, I think, only increase. If you think about the world Tim was describing, where it's embedded in click and collect and all these things, waiting for a web page to load, all of those things is just going to feel like more friction. Imagine if you had to wait for a web page to load, the equivalent of turning the light switch on, right? It's going to be just more and more a demand.
Well, it should get out of the way. It shouldn't be something that you experience as a user. It should just be there, and it should just work, right?
Yes.
Guillermo, I really want to get your opinion on this, because your work as an open source maintainer, creator, contributor from a long time has been in this intersection of making technologies that essentially disappears so that users have a better experience. So what is in your mind regarding this evolution that we have been, as Tim really correctly mentioned, we have been kind of forced upon, and what do you see coming down the line?
Yeah, I'll agree with Tim that the edge, I think, is the largest step function change that has happened to the entire industry and ecosystem, especially open source, because if there's one thing that, companies will think twice before they try to self-host or operate it themselves, is an entire edge network. So it changes open source as well, because open source was always kind of fixated on this idea of, here's the code, here's the binary, go and run it. This is how MongoDB, one of the first and most successful open source based companies, started. Now the demands are changing, and they're changing because of an end user requirement that they want fast and they want personalized. So now the software has to be running all over the world. So something that Next.js is investing a lot in for the last couple of years is bridging this gap between open source and this idea that you're kind of deploying your code everywhere. So we started with the serverless functions support, where you create an API folder. And now when you're developing on localhost, it's all running monolithically inside a server, a dev server. Now, when you deploy to the cloud, we have customers that deploy this in 16 regions, or the region is closest to their database, or a hybrid of the two. So that's sort of the future of edge compute as well. You're going to have a development model that you can reason about, and that, to Filip's point, you have to have that tool always there. We call this internally hoisting. So if there was an expensive third-party script, you can hoist it to the edge. Next.js will always try to do a lot of automation here. So for example, for Jamstack, when we detect that your page is static, we hoist it to the edge automatically. You never configure caches, you never invalidate manually, etc. I think there's going to be tons and tons and tons of code that over time will be hoisted to the edge. But to the point about education that we've been sharing throughout the panel, I should say that developers can still always do the wrong thing with powerful systems, right? So this is the beauty of code. You can do anything. You can run a while true loop that mines Dogecoin at the edge, and your pages are not going to be fast, right? So this is where our other investment.
You're giving people ideas, man. Be careful.
I'm like,
I'm going to go to Vercel.com and start doing some.
Well, our solution there is to give you, I call this Clippy, right? Like a good version of, hopefully, where, in Word, the idea was, let's try to give you hints. So I do think it's important to give developers conformance guidelines and linting tools that'll tell them, hey, like, you have to make this better. It's too expensive. A good example is, yes, pages from 1995 were probably fast, but nowadays, if you use the image tag without width, without height, and without lazy load and async and all that, it's still a really slow 1995 page on a modern device. So that's where conformance kicks in. So Next.js can tell you, hey, you could use the image element, but I would recommend that you use the image component instead that has all this extra logic for performance. So I think this tension will forever exist. Developers have all the power. I love that, having been a developer myself, but then you kind of need the guidelines and the supporting technology and hooks to be able to put the code in the right places.
Actually, I think following on that, like Lighthouse, I've been criticizing Lighthouse for a while in this panel, but fundamentally, I think Lighthouse is great. And the suggestions it gives you at the bottom actually may not move your Lighthouse performance score, but they will give you a better experience overall in those cases, and actually probably improve your core vitals, even if they don't budge your Lighthouse score. So I totally agree with that.
They make you build better websites, right? Yeah. It's really important to follow those things. It's actually quite simple. Anyway, sorry, Israel, go for it.
No, even the report mentions there, like, these are not direct things that will affect the score, but you may want to look at them. So that's very important. Annie, I wanted to come back to you. We're nearing the end of the time we have allotted for this panel, but I don't want to leave it without asking you for some teasers. Let's say, what is next for the metrics team? So what are you working on a new version of more updates to the metrics that we have? Are you working on a new metric? You can maybe give us some insights. Remember that by the time we're airing this, Google I/O has happened. So you can give us some teasers.
Yeah, so basically, as Ishan mentioned, we promised we wouldn't update more than once a year, and we're trying to take the tension of we really want to address things, but we also don't want to constantly change the core web vitals. So I think updates are going to be a bit slow. We're definitely thinking about the single page app problem and what we can do about it and how we can better evolve the metrics to understand single page apps and fit them better. We're also looking into whether we could do something more comprehensive about responsiveness. Right now we have first input delay. Should we be looking at all of the inputs? Should we be looking at more of the input, the interaction? We're looking at whether it makes sense to look at smoothness, smooth scrolling and drop frames, and whether more non-performance related metrics like accessibility might make sense.
That's definitely seems like a great addition, and I hope we have an opportunity to then follow up on that on maybe a part 3 of the panel. But for the time being, Annie, where can we hear more about what you and the and the metrics team are working on?
So we blog at web.dev. There's a blog with a lot of core web vitals metric stuff. And if we have posts about like things we're thinking about, areas for feedback, we'll put it there, web.dev/blog. And also the web performance working group is where we kind of talk about ideas for how we could fit these things into standards.
Guillermo, I wanted to jump now to you. So where can we hear more about how Vercel is taking the performance journey to the next level and what you're up to?
Yeah, so follow us on Vercel on Twitter. Obviously, you'll be finding out about the releases of Next.js. We have Next.js 11 coming up with a lot of the kind of architectural pieces that I talked about. It's really exciting and completely backwards compatible. And then I also recommend checking out vercel.com/analytics if you want to get a quick glimpse of what it looks like to be getting this real user data to inform your development process every step of the way, with performance and user experience as the priority.
All right, we'll definitely take a look at that. Filip, where can we hear more about the performance journey of VueStoreFront and what you're up to?
Yes, so we also have a blog, and we are blogging there pretty often. Recently, mostly about integrations, but also from time to time about the performance. I'm also doing this myself on the conferences on Twitter, so you can follow VueStoreFront or Phil Rakowski. And our next goal right now is to explore different ways of making it easier for our users to actually build a well-performing websites, but in a way that is seamless for them. So as I said at the beginning, to kind of like enforce these best practices, but in a way that is still feels natural for our users to build. But at the same time, under the hood, we'll be doing a bunch of different optimizations that they don't even aware of. So that's our goal, and I think Vercel and Next.js, you're doing a great job in this, and I think like the whole industry should learn from you.
Thank you.
Ishan, where can we hear more about what Layer Zero is doing? Maybe a bit about the announcement you mentioned about the ROM product and what you are up to.
Yeah, so actually I'll put it in terms of the audience. So first thing you need to do on the Core Vitals journey, you want to educate, measure, and then optimize. So to educate, we have a newsletter, corewebvitals.email, where it's just every week, every 2 weeks, just news about Core Vitals. That's a good way to get educated. The second is you want to measure. So we have Core Web Vitals RUM, or analytics, that's real time. It'll be a lot faster than what you get out of Google Search Console, and it's free to use. So just go to layer0.co, and you can sign up for free and install it on your site. You can even add it with one of those evil tag managers that's putting a bunch of things that are slowing your site down. This one won't. Just put it on, see where you're at with the Core Web Vitals. And then the last one is when you want to get to that stage to optimize, then you can sign up for the rest of the Layer 0 platform. And there are a lot of things we've got in there to help you get a faster site.
Wonderful. And Tim, where can we hear more about what you and Uniform are doing in this space?
Well, before I go there, I must say I use Layer 0's RUM and Vercel Analytics on different projects. Anyways, I just wanted to get it out there because they're both actually going hard at it, updating all the time. It's really awesome. Anyway, so at Uniform, of course, we're working on this personalization story and this modern way of doing that with all the tools we've just discussed here. And we're actually now starting a blog. We've been writing quite a bit. We have a YouTube channel and on Twitter, and we're mainly working on showing how magical it can be if personalization actually works, because it has been so hard to do that a lot of developers don't even know you can do it. A lot of people come to us like, yeah, we want to do A/B testing. It's like, but actually personalization is much more interesting. And because it has been so hard, we're trying to just really show off how to do it in such a simple way in Jamstack and on the edge and things like that. So you can go to uniform.dev to see a bunch of our blog posts and YouTube videos about us. And also on Twitter, it's also uniform dev, or my account at Tim Benniks. Because I'm really doing more the developer relations. And this is actually a pretty hard part to speak about personalization because, like I said, a lot of developers haven't done it. But if you can see how it works on hydration time and how simple it is, you'll see that, I'm going to get pretty busy. And it's happening since I spoke on the VueStoreFront Summit where we showed this off. And it was really cool to see how people responded to it. So yes, follow us on Twitter to see what's up.
Well, I definitely do already, but I welcome everybody
Yes,
to do as well. But for the rest, well, thank you very much for being here and for being part of this second part of our panel. I hope we have a chance to follow up with maybe a third panel. There was one comment here in our private chat, but for the time being, I really thank you once again for being part of JS World Conference USA. And well, back to you, Amanda.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us at this panel. I learned a lot, actually. So thank you for this fascinating conversation.
Having us.
Yeah.
See you in part 3.
Yes.
Yeah, part 3.
Part 3 it is. There we go.
All right. Well,
Awesome. Cheers,
thank you, everybody.